Take a deep breath. Welcome to the 14th Annual Rochester Chesterton Conference. Thank you. Yeah, it's a minor miracle. Okay. Anyway, we have a lot of people to thank. Primarily, of course, the Bazillion Fathers of Rochester, who have funded us every year to have our Saturday of shenanigans, and they are very gracious, and they've been very generous, and and we've lost a number of them in the past few years, very sadly, and we'll hear about Father Leo Hetzler in a few minutes. The staff of St. John Fisher College has been immensely helpful. They're very courteous and very kind, and they put up with us because we really are an outside group, and they have treated us really well. So I truly have to thank them for their help. And then we have all kinds of volunteers that have helped. I mean, you see these people running around today, sound man over here and all these other people, and and they're nameless, and I'm not going to tell anyone who they are because I don't want anyone stealing them away. But they make this thing really possible because they just go to work and put everything together, and they let me do the panic, which I do well. You got to work with your skills. Mine is anxiety. And why be anxious if you're an amateur, Dale? You know what I'm saying? Never mind. He doesn't listen to me. Okay. So I just want to say, and John Hayes for doing all kinds of printing for us, and just a whole host of people have really helped us all the way along. A list of them, is on the back of this program, and that list is incomplete because I just copy and paste from last year's program like everybody else. Sorry. But they know who they are, and I just want to express my thanks to them. Okay. I think we could begin with the more serious material. We stand on the shoulders of giants. And that's a phrase that somebody came up with in the Middle Ages, and it holds today, and I never took the time to look up who said that, but it's a great phrase because it really expresses what Christendom is. And so today we're going to focus on four literary figures who kind of express what Christendom is, what the best of it. And as you see from the poster, it's Dante, Shakespeare, Dickens, and I think G.K. Chesterton. So we're going to talk about each one. And actually, the underlying theme here that I'm struggling to express is one of resonance. Resonance. I mean, for music, you hit the piano key and the guitar kind of vibrates. You know what I mean? Because that note just is just right. All kinds of instances in physics, or if you ever listen to Mrs. Miller sing "A Hard Day's Night," your feelings resonate. You remember, you have to be a certain age to appreciate that one. But the point is, resonance. I mean, you see it in one writer and another. For example, I mean, if you take Newman and C.S. Lewis and Chesterton, you've got three very different people who come to the faith from very different directions, or to Christianity anyway, from very different directions. And yet they say the same thing, only they say it differently. And it's that kind of resonance that's always really attracted me. I just find it so fascinating. Here's three people who, if they were in an elevator, it would be a weird elevator if they were in it, But I mean, you'd wonder, wow, they don't they don't belong on the same planet in many ways, and yet, you know, they're one in these fundamental things. So what are those things that make us resonate? You know, resonance, I mean, it's a thing, it's just not just a thing of the mind, it's a thing of the heart, it's a thing of the soul. You know, and you can't talk about really Dante at all, I mean, unless you talk about Aquinas. And, you know, the soul is the form of the body. And I mean, that's really, that just completely twists around what the world says. But I mean, it's really an important concept. Aquinas is really an important underlying thing. I mean, like they're all standing on Aquinas, you know, in a way. Certainly Dante is, and I think we'll hear more about that. But these are all Thomistic writers in their way, and some of them may surprise you, but particularly Chesterton, I think, and Dante, they exude a lived Thomism. They don't just, you know, resonate with Aquinas, they breathe Aquinas, really. Yeah. I can't really do justice to this theme in a few minutes. You know, so I have to talk fast, I guess, right? But the point is, I gotta be at about 10,000 feet to really talk about this concept, because I think it's huge, and I think it's really why you read these different people and why you study them. You know, because they do resonate somehow, and they resonate in ways that are very difficult sometimes to pinpoint, but we can swoop down and, you know, and catch a few of these. Certainly, all these writers, if there's a feature about them that's really kind of they have in common, just structurally and in terms of style, it's a love of what Chesterton called the picturesque. They don't just talk about. They show you pictures. Dante shows you pictures of what happens in hell and what you're suffering in purgatory, you know, and what paradise would really look like from a poet's perspective. They all certainly understand the fundamental Christian paradox, that innocence, you know, will triumph, that the weak will confound the strong. And you know, the Reformation, you know, wasn't successful with the later writers because they certainly talk about purgatory. You know, and Dante has this whole purgatorio where he and Virgil start climbing the 7-story mountain of purgatory after being in hell, which is you know, the Inferno. Everybody reads the Inferno and they think it's nice and see what happens to all these horrible sinners and everything. But you know, frankly, you got to go on with Dante because the better stuff is afterwards. I think you know, and after a while you find the Inferno kind of tedious until you get down to where Satan, you know, in this wonderful kind of Thomistic image is you know, sort of frozen in ice, a complete mockery of being and a complete mockery of God. Then you get down to his navel, apparently, and then you climb up the other side, and then you start getting into purgatory. And that you know, the geology and geography I don't really understand, but that's okay. But anyway, you get into purgatory, you know, and that's where I think you really see the marvelous Christian elements in Dante, and that's where he resonates with other writers. Certainly, he resonates with Shakespeare. You know, just you know, one example. You know, Hamlet's father, I am thy father's spirit, doomed for a certain term to walk the night, and for the day confined to waste in fires, till the foul crimes done in my days of nature are burnt and purged away. You know, hardly a victory for the reformers who wanted to get rid of purgatory. But there's even more surprising evidence that these writers resonate on a subject of suffering after death. And that's in Charles Dickens. And it's peculiar that anyone, I think, offhand would link Dickens with Dante. There's no evidence that I was able to find that Dickens studied Dante at all. Like most of these writers, he didn't really have all that much of an education. Where would he have certainly picked up Dante in England in the 1800s? But there's that wonderful bit with Marley's ghost. Well, he's got a couple interesting things there, but the one thing that's, of course, that you know this line from having seen Christmas Carol is, "I wear the chains I forged in life." And I mean, that's Dante right there. That's what he's talking about in hell. The very sins that put you there are the sins that you in some perverse way suffer from. Or in purgatory, the sins that you've got to rid yourself of are the sins that you kind of suffer through and suffer for. The proud carrying stones in their back and being humbled, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All these wonderful images from Dante. And of course, in Dickens, there's another wonderful bit that's totally Thomistic. In Christmas Carol, let me read just a little bit of it. It's kind of fun. Okay, so Scrooge asks Marley's ghost to sit down. He said, "Can you sit down?" asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him. "I can." "Do it then." Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent might find himself in a condition to take a chair. Anyway, the ghost sits down. "You don't believe in me," observed the ghost. I don't," said Scrooge. "What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses?" "I don't know," said Scrooge. "Why do you doubt your senses?" Very interesting that that Dickens would say that, because that is just Thomistic. It rings of Thomism. And it's from Dickens, so you think, that's interesting. And there are other topics where Dickens surprisingly resonates with Dante, as other writers do. One of them is the peculiar, peculiar in terms of particular vision of a woman who will redeem a man. You have in Shakespeare, you have very powerful heroines. Obviously, you have Celia, the most innocent, Cordelia, the most innocent, who will basically be, in a sense, salvation of Lear, or at least lead, be a vehicle for leading him to salvation. Chesterton's women are studying themselves, because they're, and Dickens' women too. There's a nobility, and I would say even Dickens had a Beatrice that he pointed to that like Beatrice in Dante, leading him on after Virgil can only lead him to a certain point, and he sees Beatrice, who relates to almost pure idealized beauty that Dante found. Dickens has really the same character in Copperfield, in Agnes. And if you know Copperfield's story, it's quite a story of suffering, and yet there's some marvelous pieces in it. After his first wife dies, he's very saddened, and he kind of plunges himself into work. And he's met Agnes before, and his late wife knew him, and it was the last person that she had wanted to talk to before she died. He pulls a letter from his pocket. Okay. He's just seen all kinds of suffering, and he's seen Another young lady who was disgraced, saved by this marvelous Peggotty, and now he's going to take her to Australia or something to found a new life and get away from her past. I mean, it's angst, it's beautiful sadness, it's glorious. He takes out her letter and he reads it. I just thought this was so beautiful, illustrative of Beatrice. Okay. The packet was in my hand. I opened it and read the writing of Agnes. She was happy and useful and prospering as she had hoped. That was all she told me of herself. The rest referred to me. She gave me no advice. She urged no duty on me. She only told me in her own fervent manner what her trust in me was. She knew, she said, how such a nature as mine would turn affliction to good. She knew how trial and emotion would exalt and strengthen it. She was sure that in my every purpose I should gain a firmer and higher tendency to the grief I had undergone. She who so gloried in my fame and looked forward to its augmentation well knew that I would labor on. She knew that in me sorrow could not be weakness, but must be strength. As the endurance of my childish days had done its part to make me what I was, so greater calamities would nerve me on to be yet better than I was. And so as they had taught me, would I teach others. She commended me to God, who had taken my innocent darling, his previous wife, to her rest, and in her sisterly affection cherished me always and was always at my side, go where I would, proud of what I had done, but infinitely prouder yet of what I was reserved to do. And that letter is really a turning point in Copperfield's resolution. He now knows what he has to do. So he meets up with Agnes 40 pages later. What I am you've made me, Agnes. You should know best. I made you, Trotwood, her affectionate name for him. Yes, Agnes, my dear girl, I said, bending over her. I tried to tell you when we met today something that has been in my thoughts since Dora died. You remember when you came down to me in our little room, pointing upward, Agnes? Pointing upward. Oh, Trotwood, she returned, her eyes filled with tears. Can I ever forget? As you were then, my sister, I have often thought since you have been to me. Ever pointing upward, Agnes. Ever leading me to something better. Ever directing me to higher things. Which, if you've read Dante, it just absolutely resonates with Beatrice and the pull of his whole will and what Beatrice does to him. And that's Dickens. How do they resonate so much? Dickens didn't steal that from Dante. There's something there. There's something there of the soul. Anyway, I'm hoping that our speakers will give you some idea of how these great writers resonate with each other and represent the best of Christendom and of Christian culture. Okay, God bless you. Jean is going to give a brief memorial to Father Leo Hetzler, my wife Jean.
Our 14th Chesterton Conference is dedicated to the memory of Father Leo Hetzler, born into eternal life May 18th, 2017. Father Hetzler was our guide and mentor at nearly every one of our Chesterton Society meetings for 16 years until his death from pancreatic cancer at age 91. Leo was a soldier. Right out of high school, he was mustered in and thrown into World War II as a combat infantryman in Patton's 86th Division, the Blackhawks, fighting at the Battle of the Bulge, coming home at the end of the European War, and being sent immediately with his division to the Philippines. They were the only division to see both theaters. At the end of the war, Leo went to visit a high school friend who had also served and survived a German POW camp. It was the first time the two, having left as boys, were seeing each other after the war. Father was fond of telling us his friend swung open the door and said, "Leo, have I got a book for you?" It was Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton. Leo went to the public library and read every Chesterton book on the shelf. Father Hetzler was a scholar, earning his degree in English literature and writing his doctoral dissertation at Cornell on Chesterton. For 2 summers, he studied in England, living in Chesterton's Beaconsfield house with full access to Chesterton's books and papers, carefully maintained by Dorothy Collins, GK's beloved secretary. Father Hetzler became a renowned Chesterton scholar, and when Dorothy Collins was asked who was her favorite author on Chesterton, she said, Father Leo Hetzler. As a dedicated teacher, he taught English at Aquinas High School and St. John Fisher College for 30 years. It's said that when he taught Shakespeare, he read the play out loud, acting out every part himself. Most important to him was his priesthood. His vocation was the foundation from which all of his other roles drew strength. He loved being a priest, but would often marvel with great humility, "I can't believe God chose me to be a priest, when there were so many guys I knew who were so much more worthy." Traveling far and wide up to his 90th year, most often in his capacity as a chaplain of the Combat Infantry of America, he was caught complaining to his fellow Basilian, the late Father Joe Lanzalaco, that he felt tired and had to sit down more often. To which Father Lanzalaco replied, "Leo, you're not 82 anymore." Never condescending, always interested in others, humble, charitable, and funny. All those lives he touched fondly recall his arsenal of jokes and stories, entertaining anyone fortunate enough to be with him. His mind was sharp to the end of his life, preferring to talk literature and history and relate his funny stories instead of bombarding his friends with health and treatment woes. At the end of his illness, word got out that Leo could die at any moment. A steady stream of people came to see him in the course of 24 hours. He rallied and improved a bit. After a few days of not dying, he said he felt bad because of all those people who had visited him, expecting him to pass away, and he didn't want to disappoint them. It was a privilege to know this great priest and soldier, and we'll never forget him. We have a picture here of Father Hetzler receiving the American Chesterton Society Lifetime Achievement Award. It's a little like a fat Oscar. There's an important person missing from the picture. He might not be that important because we cropped him out. But even so, the picture was taken 10 years ago. That guy still looks the same and is wearing the same clothes. Please welcome Dale Ahlquist.
Father Leo always wore the same clothes. Come on, Mama, do it to me now. Okay, there we go, there we go. Ah, it's nothing's happening. Oh, there we go, there we go. All right. Well, I want to thank Lou and Jean for putting on this conference for 14 years. I've only spoken at 14 of them. And I'm really pleased today that I can go first rather than last, because now I can give my talk, sit down with the rest of you, and fall asleep. Because when I speak last, I have to stay awake through the other talks, because I figure I usually have to correct something that someone else has said. When Lou was putting this the schedule together, the question was, with the shoulders of giants, do you start at the bottom and go up to the top, or do you start at the top and go down? The guy who's standing on the shoulders of the others, and I'm pleased that he starts with Chesterton, and then the other talks you'll find out who the shoulders are and why they are such good shoulders. So he was perhaps the one writer, certainly the one poet, who gave the impression of writing slapdash and always finding the right word. He was a man of the people. He was an earthquake. He was a tremendous natural convulsion, bringing forth fire, wind, and storm that has not been known for a whole century of literature. He was, among many other things, the most striking example of the fact that the more narrowly national a man is as a poet, the more international he becomes. That's G.K. Chesterton's description of the poet Robert Burns. And he gave that at a London Burns Club dinner in 1923. And incidentally, that was the first time that BBC Radio ever broadcast a remote speaker who was not in the studio. And the fact that they chose G.K. Chesterton to do this new experimental broadcasting of a remote speaker over some other literary or political celebrity shows how important Chesterton was in his own day, and the great high regard that his own country had for him. But the point, of course, is that Chesterton's description of Robert Burns is a description of himself. He would not admit it, but we can admit it. 22 years earlier, when no one knew who G.K. Chesterton was, when his essays in the London Daily News were still unsigned, written anonymously, he offered an assessment of another literary giant, Robert Louis Stevenson, another Scotsman. And again, it's a stunning description of himself. Stevenson is a peculiarly difficult man for any biographer to estimate fairly. The reason lies in the fact that his personality was, as it were, singularly light and slippery, and that this slipperiness and levity arose not from eccentricity, but from a swift and unconquerable common sense. We are so rooted in open and systematic morbidities, in inhuman prejudices, in respectable monomanias, that a sane man terrifies us like a lunatic. Stevenson was peculiarly the embodiment of this elvish sanity. He is continually startling us in his letters, not because his remarks are peculiar, but because they are a little more sensible than anything we had ever thought of. He was a sincere moralist and a sincere artist. He danced with that divine frivolity which is the best definition of faith. It is said in some quarters that Stevenson has been overpraised, that a reaction has set in against him, and that he will not fascinate the next generation. It matters not one rap whether he does or does not, to anyone who has perceived his absolute solidity and his eternal use to mankind. If we in this age had a little more faith in certainties and a little less dread of caprice and reaction and changes of public opinion, we should gain more credit for sense in the long run. Stevenson will win, not because he has friends or admirers or the approval of the public or the assent of aesthetes. He will win because he is right. A word of great practical import, which needs to be rediscovered. He may or may not be eclipsed for a time. It would be a truer way of putting it that the public may or may not be eclipsed for a time. There's a few great lines in that passage that, of course, are worth repeating as they apply to Chesterton. He had a swift and unconquerable common sense, an elvish sanity. He startles us with what he says because it is a little more sensible than anything we had ever thought of. And he was right. Stevenson was one of the giants who came just before Chesterton. Another giant who came just before Chesterton was also a huge influence on him, and that was George MacDonald. Chesterton describes MacDonald as an elemental figure, a man unconnected with any particular age, a character in one of his own fairy tales, a true mystic to whom the supernatural was natural. A curious glow pervades his books, and the flowers seem like colored flames broken loose from the flaming heart of the world. Every bush of gorse is a burning bush, burning for the same cause as that of Moses. This sense of a perfect secret, almost painfully kept by the universe, is what shames the weariness of modern mystics, as if anyone who knew a secret could be weary. That's just a marvelous and mystical reflection. And Chesterton understands that MacDonald is a mystic. He understands it because Chesterton is a mystic, one to whom the supernatural was natural. Now, few, if any, of Chesterton's contemporaries recognized him as a mystic. His fame, as it grew, people continued to recognize there was something special about him, something unique, but they were at a loss to explain what it was. In 1912, an anonymous reviewer of one of Chesterton's books of criticism calls Chesterton a romantic, but a didactic romantic, an orthodox romantic, who differs from other critics in that he has a warm friendliness and searches out what is essential in a man or a book and finds something positive where others discern only feebleness or irrelevancy. And yet, this reviewer says, Mr. Chesterton is one who belongs by nature to the opposition. He's always, by instinct, for the defense of what is attacked or for the attack of what is in vogue. And yet he always delivers a true verdict, one that is satisfactory to the moral consciousness. Belongs by nature to the opposition. A very good description of Chesterton, defending what is attacked, but attacking what is in vogue. He established his reputation as a true controversialist in his very first book of essays, The Defendant. And in the introduction to that book, he says, "Now it has appeared to me unfair that humanity should be engaged in perpetually calling all those things bad which have been good enough to make other things better, in everlastingly kicking down the ladder by which it has climbed. It appeared to me that progress should be something else besides continual parricide." That's great. "Therefore, I have investigated the dust heaps of humanity and found a treasure in all of them. I found that humanity is not incidentally engaged, but eternally and systematically engaged in throwing gold into the gutter and diamonds into the sea. And I have found that every man is disposed to call the green leaf of the tree a little less green than it is, and the snow of Christmas a little less white than it is. Therefore, I have imagined that the main business of man, however humble, is defense. And I have conceived that a defendant is chiefly required when worldlings despise the world, that a counsel for the defense would not have been out of place on that terrible day when the sun darkened over Calvary and man was rejected of man. A few years later, when he writes Orthodoxy, he refers to that incident at Calvary as the moment when God was forsaken of God. When Chesterton stands on the shoulders of giants, he's also standing on the shoulders of the common man who came before him. He enjoys the anonymous wisdom of his ancestors. He respects the democracy of the dead. That's why he defends tradition. It's why he belongs by nature to the opposition. What is tradition? Chesterton says tradition is an impression of a vast multitude of minds. It arises out of a vast number of different things, but it nevertheless is a single impression. And to the present age, it always seems like it's out of touch with the truth. And yet, says Chesterton, this failure to realize reality is more marked in the person who renounces tradition rather than in the person who exaggerates it. The one who realizes the importance of tradition is more in touch with reality than the one who's always rejecting it. Chesterton is always defending tradition against fads, against fashions, against the current spirit, what he calls the spirit that's always running noisily and always running away. Modern philosophies don't stick. They don't stick because they're not grounded. Chesterton says that the modern philosopher uses a method where he detaches his brain from his head and just lets it run by itself. He cuts his own head off and locks it in a box at the beginning of the day. And then with the rest of himself, he goes about his business, eating, drinking, working, fighting, falling in love. Then comes back in the evening and opens the box to find out what conclusions his head has come to. And he immediately accepts them. Whereas the real philosopher thinks not just with his head, but with his heart, with his hands, with his feet, and with the boots on his feet. And that's the kind of thinker Chesterton was. He was the real philosopher, thinking with his head and his heart and his whole self. Thus he wrote about everything. And because he thought with everything, he put everything into his writing and wrote about everything. And for me, that's one of the things that makes him such a great writer and such a pleasure to read. But this is precisely why some people don't like Chesterton, because he writes about everything. And to think about everything is a lot of work. And most people are just content to concentrate on the one thing that they're interested in, if they're interested in that many things. And if Chesterton should happen to agree with them, then they will tolerate him. They may even affirm him in that narrowly thing that they're agreeing with him in. Or they may even like him, but within limits. But when Chesterton writes about art and literature and politics and religion and economics and philosophy and popular culture and the family and the non-family, the saints and the demons, and God and the devil, their attitude is, well, he would be great if he just left politics out of it. Or if he would be so great if he just kept his religion to himself. He would be great if he just left out the thing that I disagree with and makes me feel uncomfortable. For instance, when he writes about democracy. Democracy is an idea that we all claim to like. And Chester likes democracy too. But then he actually defines what he means by democracy. He says it means citizens should have a very direct power on the action of the state, not merely an agreement to a state of affairs. They should be the rulers. Admittedly, that's a difficult thing to manage. It's managed best in small societies, village democracies, and so on. In big states, it's very difficult. But the problem might be solved if the people at least had an idea of what it is. Democracy means not the citizen voting, but the citizen ruling. We could easily imagine a society in which every man, woman, dog, and cat might have a vote. But if the government took no notice of their voting, it would not be a democracy. That is becoming more and more the actual condition of today. The governments are too strong, their masses of capital, their concentration of wealth in a few hands, their scientific armaments, and whatnot, to be actually forced by the citizens to obey them. The man who votes in a large state has practically no power. First of all, he has to vote for 10 things at once, and secondly, he has no means of making the elected person carry out his promises. The real meaning of democracy is equality, economic and moral, as well as political. And Chesterton says democracy can only be saved by a better and more equitable distribution of the wealth of the community. And when people hear that, they go, oh man, it was so good until he said that. He's a socialist. Or they say, he's a socialist. But this is what Chesterton says about socialism. He says the socialist solution is a sort of blind growth for extension of the present evil. As under the present system, all wealth has been going into fewer and fewer hands, socialism would put it into the fewest hands of all, into the hands of the state, which actually means the officials or the politicians. Socialism only carries the movement towards centralization of capital a step further. It merges the monopolies into one great merger called government. Not really an endorsement of socialism. He also says it's a curious irony that the people who profess the utmost horror of armies are generally the people who extend all the disadvantages of militarism to ordinary social life. Just let that sink in for a while. So, democracy. He does not imagine that democracy is a utopia because he says a utopia is never a democratic creation. It's always, in its nature, despotic. He predicts that what is coming on Earth is the opposite of what is generally considered utopia. He says it'll be a utopia of ugliness, with slavery instead of comradeship. In other words, we will be asked to give up our liberty for something not finer, but something actually less generous, less effective, less efficient than the normal life of man. What is coming upon us is a certain type of unacceptable vulgarity and vapid, colorless unification. And he says, I absolutely refuse an ideal which would substitute the best time in the world, no matter how glorious the comradeship, how splendid the festivity, or how just the equality wouldn't substitute any of those things for the human home. And that kind of danger, the danger from the modern commercial concentration, is the real danger for liberty. If you would just leave that stuff out. Chesterton's remembered for his books, but his fame during his lifetime and his daily bread was from his journalism. And he made his living writing for the newspapers, and he also was fully aware of the inherent weakness of journalism because it gave a false picture of life. Not just fake news, but news. Because news was always the exceptional. It was always the unordinary. It was always the strange thing that was reported. You know, yes, he said people would wonder why a banker is found with his throat slit, but he says the real mystery is how so many bankers are not found with their throats slit. Can't mention all the people who aren't divorced and all the houses that aren't burglared. The vast mass of mankind, he says, would get on much better with their wives and neighbors and religion than anyone would suppose based on their reading of the newspaper. He's prophetic about the power of the media, but he's also provides some grounding to those who ascribe to the media more power than it actually has. For instance, there was nothing to that dramatic pause at all, except I almost drank from this water that was up here, and this is from last year's conference. His great adversary, George Bernard Shaw, was talking about the film made in 1922. It would have been a silent movie of Oliver Twist, Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist. And Shaw says that the censor had taken out some of the scenes. The scene that was banned was one of the pickpocket scenes, because the censor thought that made the pickpocket look like a hero. It glamorized pickpocketing. And Shaw says, well, that's the filmmaker's own fault. They have themselves to thank for the infamous crime scenes that they've been presenting to child audiences throughout the provinces. And Chesterton said that was stupid. He really had little belief in the power of the artistic presentation of the film in making criminals out of people. He says, if there's any growth of crime among the young, I'm quite sure that it's less due to the crime depicted in movies than to the breaking up of the family and to the loss of the religious atmosphere of our culture. 1922, he said that. And when he said things like that, people cheered. People knew that's someone finally speaking common sense. That's why he was so appreciated in his own time. People were refreshed by common sense because they never heard it from anyone else. One anonymous reporter spoke for the legions of Chesterton's fans when he says, in his hearty detestation of cranks and theorists of all kinds, Chesterton shows himself to be a sound social physician. And we're still refreshed by Chesterton when he says, what the world wants is good hard work and good sound play and lots of laughter, lots of color, and a generous exercise of all the emotions. And then he startles us when he says that he believes all these good things were spoiled by the Reformation. Oh, if only he hadn't said that. He said the Reformation introduced a sour and curdling element that led inevitably to atheism and Bolshevism. Europe ceased to be happy and well when medieval civilization came to an end. Had Wycliffe and Hus and Calvin and Luther and Knox taken a broad view of things and drunk some beer, instead of bothering about reform, Europe, under the aegis of the church and emperor as in Dante's conception, would have regained the golden age by now. So that's a heartwarming ecumenical thing to say on this, the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. But if you were listening closely, you would have heard me mentioning Chesterton mentioning Dante. And his reference to Dante in that passage talked about empire. Chesterton would never be someone speaking up on behalf of empire. And yet, he says, the only theory of imperialism that seems to me sound is Dante's. He defended the Roman Empire as the best human government on the definite ground that the best human government would probably crucify God. Caesar had to be lawful because Christ had to be killed by law. So now, without completely leaving Dante, let us bring up Dickens. Chesterton wrote about Dickens more than about any other author. His book on Dickens, I would say, is one of the 5 best books he wrote. I'm going to read you something he wrote about Dickens even before he wrote that book. In fact, before he wrote just about everything else he wrote. This is from a 1902 essay. He says, "The mistake about Dickens arose, of course, because of the present or recent critical generation has forgotten altogether that there was even such a thing as the great literature of joy. We have fallen into a way of thinking that literature is a refuge for weak temperaments, that literature may express all the darker and quainter moods, all the moods of regret or rebellion or hesitation, but never that one universal mood, streaming like a river through heaven and earth, by which alone all things consent to live. Dickens seems to us vulgar and impossible and sprawlingly inartistic for the simple reason that he's too strong for us. His bewildering crowds and mobs of characters, his vast mazy travels over England and America, his endless banquets and conversations, his intense realism, and his frantic unreality are all manifestations of a quite insatiable and omnivorous power of mental pleasure to which our period has lost the key. He was the last of the great comic writers, and since his time we have lost the power of realizing the connection between the words great and comic. We have forgotten that Aristophanes and Rabelais stand with Aeschylus and Dante, that their folly was wiser and more solid than our wisdom, and their levity has outlasted 100 philosophies. Dickens exaggerates, and it's not a fault but a merit. If you were listening closely, you would have heard the word Dante come up there. He says that Dickens writes the literature of joy. And there's the great reference to Dante at the beginning of Chesterton's book on Dickens, where he says, just leave all your old ideas behind and start to embrace joy now and hope. And he says at the beginning of the book, abandon all hopelessness, you who enter here. But Dante reaches the literature of joy when he gets to paradise. And there are some twisted minds who take a little too much delight in reading the Inferno. If that's their pleasure, well, that's their pleasure. But the Paradiso really is the literature of joy. It's the culmination of the Divine Comedy, which is not only the praise of God's love, but also of the great gift that God gave to man, which is freedom. And Chesterton refers to a passage in the Paradiso, which he says he wishes he knew enough Italian to appreciate and enough English to translate. And then he goes on to translate it from memory and even make it rhyme. The mightiest gift that God of his largesse made in creation, perfect even as he, most of his substance and to him most dear, he gave to the will, and it was liberty. Now, how many of you are familiar with the poet Richard Garnett? That many, huh? Okay. Well, Chesterton said that publishers do not deny that they are publishers unless there are poets lurking about. And Chesterton did his share of reviewing books of poetry, and he makes all kinds of references to minor poets, but he does review a book of poetry by Richard Garnett. And he always finds something to praise, and he praises one of Garnett's sonnets on Dante. And in the poem, the speaker demands of the Italian poet how he dared to pass through hell and heaven. And the poet answers that he has done no more than the questioner and every man must do. Now that's very good. That's all of Richard Garnett that I've ever read, which was in a review that Chesterton wrote of his book. But that's a great line, that we all must pass through heaven and hell. The reality of God's judgment, the reality of separation from God, the reality of sin, but then the reality of God's grace, the reality of communion with God, and the ultimate reality of God himself. And Chesterton admits, he says, in the small artistic sense, Dante is more successful with hell than with the beatific vision. Virtuous characters are always drawn less vividly than other characters because they are so much more worth drawing. Now, Dante's greatness is in how he imagines things beyond himself, beyond even his own feelings. In contrast to the poets of today, Chesterton says, we now live among poets who cannot conceive of the universal power containing any larger feelings than their own. They cannot imagine in the tremendous words of Dante the love that drives the sun and all the stars. So how did Dante do it? Chesterton says Dante wrote that prodigious thing, not of course believing that its story was literally true, but believing that its philosophy was absolutely true, and that all counter-philosophies were the lies of devils. Out of the furnace of that certainty came those tremendous things, and to this day, all our clever, irreligious poetry is only an echo of them. Good description of the giant Dante. The idea of modern irreligious poetry being only an echo of great religious poetry brings up the whole idea of originality. There's really nothing original about reacting against great art or about rebelling and rejecting something. Well, maybe there is, because that's what original sin is. But when it comes to art, artists and critics are just obsessed with whether or not a work of art is original. Chesterton, in fact, they make this criticism of Shakespeare, that Shakespeare borrowed his plots. And Chesterton says, well, if Shakespeare borrowed, he jolly well paid back. And in my brief remarks, that's my only reference to Shakespeare, okay? Except that you should buy this book, which is Chesterton's writings on Shakespeare. It's a fabulous book, and that's why I don't need to say anything more, because it's all in this book. You should also buy this book, which has nothing to do with anything that I'm saying at all in this talk. But it's a great novel called Get Louis Stiggs, and you just should buy it, okay? And now back to our regularly scheduled program. Chesterton says that the idea of originality, like a good many other of the bold, wild, breezy ideas which critics are so fond, would seem to be almost entirely a modern idea. The idea belonging to the age of fashions and overeducation. Homer was not original. Dante was not original. Raphael was not original. None of these great men were original. They lived in a great tradition of literature. They conceived that they had a claim upon all the wisdom of the world, an intellectual communism. A theme was with them something what a song is to singers, a piece of music is to pianists, a thing which anyone might have a try at. People are very fond of discussing what is the cause of the comparative dwindling of literary greatness in our time. It may, after all, be that literature is dying of originality and starving from lack of plagiarism. It may be that if we wish to build high, we must build more in concert. Here you get the idea of the shoulders of giants, right? But then he says, but if we wish to retain the liberty of elves, we must retain their stature. So we've got giants, but then we have elves. And remember what Chesterton said about Stevenson's elvish sanity? I've described Chesterton as an elf, but a giant elf. Because of course he's a giant. He has the humility of an elf, the sanity of an elf, the magic of an elf, but he has the stature of a giant. And he was a giant standing on the shoulders of giants. But what makes our man Chesterton one of the giants? Well, let's mention the obvious thing. No, let's not. No, let's. He was big. Big, 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 big. The guy who could stand up on a bus and offer his seat to 3 women at one time, right? He was tall. People forget how tall he was, and that people were, when he walked through the room, they always looked up because he filled up the room both ways. And he said, I'm not short myself, though the popular image is one of latitude rather than longitude. Longitude, sorry. And of course, there's the paradox that giants are usually bad guys. But he was, although the largest man in the room, he did everything he could to make himself the smallest man in the room. He had a gigantic literary output. The great work that my friend Geir Hostens is doing, aided by an amazing army of volunteers of tracking down everything Chesterton wrote. Geir's bibliography of Chesterton has now reached 1,000 pages. The bibliography, folks. But he not only wrote a lot, what he wrote was big. He wrote big. Monsignor Ronald Knox, in his introduction to Chesterton's Father Brown story, says that just as Chesterton's bigness overflowed his surroundings, so in his writings he never found the literary genre that really perfectly suited him because the suit was always too small. His philosophy of life was too large to fit onto any page or into any poem or story or essay or book. There was always too much meat in the sandwich. He wrote about eternity. That always overflows out of the page. He wrote about the everlasting man. He thrilled the world with his writing until the world was perhaps spoiled by it. And then the world managed to forget about it. In March of 1936, Chesterton gave his Spice of Life broadcast on BBC Radio. He found himself once again playing the role of the defendant. Pointed out that it was the young people of his age, the T.S. Eliots, who were grave and sad, while Chesterton was happy. And he was happy to defend the spiritual appetite of his own age, his youth. And he finishes by saying in the face of doom, they may end with a whimper, but we will end with a bang. And while many consider this to be really his final statement to the world, it wasn't his last broadcast. He had one more the next month, just 2 months before he died. The title of his last radio broadcast in April 1936 was What the Middle Ages Meant. And talk about standing on the shoulders of giants. For him, it was the giants of the Middle Ages that really summed up, by defending them, summed up his life, and was also prophetic. The Middle Ages, of course, was marked in part by the Crusades, the war between Islam and Christendom. And Chesterton says in this speech, Islam had the just claim of preaching more equality between man and man, though less equality between man and woman. It was the real rival to Christendom, and nobody now realizes how real a rival it was. Most unfortunately, the effect of their equality was to increase our inequality. We already inherited evils from the old civilization like slavery, evils from its decay like feudalism. We were too much in a military formation, partly from Rome and partly from the war with barbarians. And now, as I see it, the blast from the east froze and fixed us into a military formation. And all our aristocratic titles merely are military degrees, as in Duke and Marquis and so on. We might have better developed our own religion had we not been at war with a rival religion. A democracy can organize a war, but an aristocracy cannot at the same time organize a democracy and a war. The enemy shoots you. There was a permanent peril. Take the Crusades. I do not mind how much you attack the Crusades as an attack if you will only remember that they were a counterattack. Muslims had conquered Spain and Sicily and were turned back at Tours. Now an invader found wandering in the middle of France cannot pretend that he was an inoffensive villager first disturbed in the neighborhood of Mecca. But the Crusades failed. And then on top of the tragedies came that great pestilence trailing behind them, which killed the best priests and people and left a lower type that had forgotten the best medieval ideals and brought the Middle Ages to an end. Now, when he refers to the pestilence, he's not talking about any bubonic plagues. He's referring to the Reformation. That's what killed the best priests and people and left a group of people that had forgotten the Middle Ages. And so in his last paragraph, he says, seeking a summary, I come back to the Gothic building. First, because it really was a new thing that came out of the Middle Ages. And second, because it was a new way of building higher than ever before. Only the spires, perhaps, but from the narrowest spire, you can see the broadest landscape. The medieval vision was very universal. Do not underrate the medieval vision. Do not be cheap about chivalry. The romance of Dante and Beatrice was new, and not the same as that of Catullus and Lesbia. It is in history what he called it, Dante would call it, a new life. Huxley asked the modern world in vain to follow reason as far as it'll go. Do not sneer at the schoolmen, Thomas Aquinas, because they followed it farther than it will go. That love and logic were fresh and free, but limited by bad conditions, as the tall churches were often built on islands. Communications were bad. Communications are now very good. And we have this wonderful engine of the wireless through which I speak to people I have never seen. So now I have nothing to do except pour out poetry fresh as Dante's and philosophy as great as the Summa. Only now that I can say it to everybody, I have not got it to say. Except, of course, Chesterton did have it to say and did say it. And he did manage to pour out poetry as fresh as Dante's and philosophy as great as the Summa because it was the same philosophy. And really the same vision of heaven and hell as Dante's, the same divine comedy. And he reminds us both of the divine and the comedy in words that are still eternal. He says the highest outcome of an interest in literature is a finer interest in life. And bad literature, as well as good, may throw a light on life if we learn to know the difference between light and darkness. There are entertaining writers, there are provocative writers, there are artistic and profound writers, and there are merely important writers. But there are very few life-changing writers that make you change your own life. And Chesterton does that. He's done it to people in this room, including the one standing here. And he's still changing lives. And with our help, he still can. That's the work we do as the American Chesterton Society. We have the ability to reach more people than ever before. Just as Chesterton realized when he spoke on the radio, now I can say it to everybody, he says. The great things that he recognized in other writers, the giants, we recognize in him. The swift and unconquerable common sense, the elvish sanity, the power of joy, the ability to connect us to the eternal, just like the Gothic spire. Chesterton is one of his great friends, W.R. Titterton, one of the first people ever to argue for Chesterton's sainthood in a book he wrote the year after Chesterton's death, said the Gothic that he loved gives us a hint of who he is. The surface of his work is often a riot of decoration, yet the outline is sane and simple. The bulk of it is majestic, and inside it is a shrine. All right, one last Chesterton quote. It happens to be on Dante. It happens to be one of my favorite Chesterton quotes. It's not always wrong to go like Dante to the brink of the lowest promontory and look down on hell. It's when you look up at hell that a serious miscalculation has probably been made. Thank you, and God bless.